Chinese Religion Part 2, Cho Dynasty. This presentation provides a brief introduction to religion during the Cho Dynasty of Chinese history. The Cho Dynasty is divided into two parts, Western Cho and Eastern, because the capital moved to the east after around 771 BC. So the Cho Dynasty as a whole was founded by King Wu of Cho. He was the ruler who raised an army to defeat the last tyrannical king of the Shang, who was called Di Xin, or King Cho of Shang. So, like the Shang dynasty, presumably, the Cho had a feudal system of government in which there was one king who ruled over the entire kingdom. However, the king delegated authority to a class of great nobles or aristocrats below him. These nobles were people who had authority over their own lands and people. However, during a time of warfare, they were required to fight in defense of the king, to send their followers as soldiers to fight in defense of the king. So this system of government was different from that of later Chinese history, where they developed a more centralized bureaucracy as well. The early Cho kings, including King Wu of Cho, were regarded as ideal rulers by Confucius. So he looked to them as moral models. So by looking at the history, we're also looking at part of the Confucian view of virtue and how to become a better person by following the good examples of history. You'll notice in the map on the right that the Chinese kingdom is still centered around the Yellow River in the north, but it's starting to creep southward to the Yangtze River in the south. The early Cho kings were the ones that Confucius admired. The one who actually raised an army to defeat Di Xin and establish the kingdom was King Wu. His name Wu means warlike or martial because he was the one who fought to create the kingdom. However, he had his father, King Wen, named the honorary first king or founder of the Cho dynasty. This was an act of xiao, or filial piety, respect for his father. The name King Wen means cultured or educated. This is a reference to the fact that King Wen was a scholar who at first tried to persuade the tyrant Cho of Shang, or Di Xin, to give up the kingdom or to mend his ways because he was ruling so poorly and so abusively. However, Di Xin refused, which is why King Wu had to raise the army to defeat him. When King Wu died, his own son was too young to take over the throne. Therefore, his younger brother, who's called the Duke of Zhou, took over as regent. He ruled in the name of the young prince, who would later be known as King Cheng, before Cheng was old enough to assume the throne. Because the Duke of Cho was loyal to his brother's memory, he did not take over the kingdom for himself, even though he could have. And in ancient times, many kings did things like this. If they were taking over as regent of their nephew or some situation like that, the regent would just seize the throne for himself and get rid of or maybe even kill the legitimate heir to the throne. The Duke of Zhou did not do that, and as soon as Cheng was old enough to take the throne, the Duke of Zhou stepped aside and let King Cheng rule. And King Cheng was also admired because he basically continued the legacy of his father, grandfather, and uncle in preserving and protecting this kingdom. So all these figures were regarded by Confucius as someone that you should look up to, admire, and try to emulate. During the Cho dynasty is when we see the development of Yin and Yang theory. So the concepts of Yin and Yang may go back to the beginnings of Chinese civilization. This is based on modern archaeology that has discovered the floor plans and layout of ancient buildings. The relation between layouts of buildings and yin and yang is that the concepts originally referred to the dark or shady side of a building or mountain, that's yin, and the bright, sunny southern side of a building or mountain, that's yang. Because China is in the northern hemisphere, during the daytime, the southern side of a hill, mountain, or building would get more sunlight than the northern side. So these concepts were talking about the shady and sunny sides of a building. Originally, it was probably mainly for pragmatic purposes that most buildings were situated so that they'd have south-facing door and windows. This was to allow more hours of sunlight during the day if you have your windows facing south in the northern hemisphere. However, eventually there developed an entire really elaborate theory of how to situate and design a building or other structure such as a tomb based on the presumed flows of natural energy. Yin and Yang themselves took on a broader meaning, so that Yin refers not just to the dark side of a building or structure, but to this kind of elemental force that's regarded as dark, as relatively passive. It's associated with the female sex, with the low position, with cool temperature, and with moisture or water. And Yang is associated with the opposite. So Yin and Yang are not thought of as evil and good, but rather two basic or elemental forces of nature. The Yang is light, but it's also active, male, the high position, warm, and dry. The Yin is fluid, the Yang is solid, etc. The symbol on the right is a later symbol developed in the Song Dynasty, Tai Chi Tu, that's used to illustrate the relation between Yin and Yang. There were many symbols used traditionally in China to represent the forces of Yin and Yang. So the white part refers to Yang, the dark part to Yin. This particular symbol is interesting because of the dynamic relation between Yin and Yang. It almost looks like one is moving towards or becoming the other. And indeed, that was the understanding of Yin and Yang that was developed in the Cho Dynasty, that they're not just fixed and static elements that never change. One can transform into the other. In fact, there is a belief that the more developed and mature one of these forces became, the more it was likely to give rise to its opposite. That concept goes back to the Cho, evidently, if you look at the texts and commentaries on the Book of Changes that was composed during the Cho, but it is symbolized in this image, this later image. You can see in the bright Yang portion of the circle, where it's at its largest size on the top, is also when it has a spot of Yin or darkness within it. So this is the old or the mature Yang that already has the seeds of its own transformation in it. So this led to a whole elaborate system of trying to analyze and understand the patterns of the changes of Yin and Yang energy in nature. Yin-Yang theory is the basis for the Cho system of divination. Unlike the Shang, they no longer used oracle bones. Instead, they used a system of drawing stalks or sticks of the yarrow plant that would be of different lengths. And the different lengths of the stalks could be interpreted to generate a series of lines. The unbroken line represents Yang energy, and the broken line represents Yin energy. These lines would be grouped into a series of 3, which is called a trigram, and a series of 6, or 2 trigrams, which is called a hexagram. Because each line in the trigram is either broken or unbroken, that makes 8 total possible trigrams, 2 to the 3rd power. And those are called the bagua, or 8 trigrams. And this image is used a lot in Chinese religion as well as traditional Chinese thought or philosophy. You can see it, for example, in some Taoist temples or other temples. So you would, the system of divination in the I Ching, which literally means the book or the classic of changes, generates a hexagram that is supposed to give you an analysis or understanding of your current situation and its likely changes in the future or what it could lead to. So this is a way of answering questions or trying to predict the future, similar to the oracle bones of Ashang. But you can also look at the I Ching as an analysis of a present situation in terms of these yin and yang forces, and also it provides a kind of general theory of the transformation of yin and yang in nature. So an important concept of the Cho religion is Tian. Tian means heaven or sky. And Tian, in a religious context, I mean, it can just refer literally to the physical sky. But in a religious or philosophical context, it has two main meanings. It can refer to a personal god, similar to the concept of Shangdi, the high god of Ashang, who was ruling over all the other spirits. In the Cho in later periods, Tian is used to refer to this heavenly ruler. Tian is also sometimes, or the heavenly ruler is also sometimes given a more specific name, such as the Jade Emperor. This was a common later name for the supreme god of heaven, and he's associated with Tian or heaven as a whole, the ruler of heaven, but he's also regarded as the supreme ruler of the cosmos, both heaven and earth, essentially. However, among the Confucians and other groups of scholars, Tian is sometimes conceived of not as a personal god, but as a kind of impersonal force, akin to natural law. So when some texts refer to Tian or heaven doing certain things, it can be a reference either to a personal god or to just a sort of cosmic order. The idea of Tian as natural law or cosmic order is something that is not the creation of humans. It's not based on human willing or wanting. It's the kind of inherent nature or fabric of the cosmos. So it's similar to the concept of natural law in a modern science, but it's regarded as this kind of impersonal force that's governing the cosmos. So the early kings of the Cho dynasty ruled well and effectively, and they were virtuous people. Later on, the quality of the kings declined. There was an infamous king, King Yo of Cho, who ruled from 795 to 771 BC. According to the later stories told by the Confucians and others, King Yo sort of neglected his first wife and queen and his eldest son, who was his legitimate heir, because he fell in love with a kind of woman of loose morals named Bao Si. She's often described as a kind of seductive concubine, someone who is very attractive but not really of good character. So this fact that he was neglecting his first queen and his legitimate heir angered the father of his first wife. The father of his first wife was a powerful nobleman named the Marquis of Shen. A marquis basically means a lord of the march or a boundary province. So he was someone who would have been important for protecting the borders of the kingdom from invasion. Now, things got even worse when King Yo decided to pull a prank on his nobles. Evidently, the Cho kings had devised a system of beacon fires, whereby if a fire were lit in a beacon tower in the capital, this would send a signal to another distant tower that could light the fire and basically send a signal of distress that the capital was under attack and needed help. That signal could be sent through these beacon fires throughout the kingdom. This was a way of alerting the nobles outside the capital that they should rush to the capital to defend it from invaders or some other type of attack. So Bao Si was notoriously difficult to impress. She would never smile. No matter what King Yo gave her or did for her, she would remain uninterested. So basically he decided to pull a prank on his nobles to generate her amusement for the sake of her, enjoyment or amusement at others' expense. He lit the beacon fires. All of his nobles thought that the capital was under attack. They armed themselves, they gathered their men, they rushed to the capital on their horses, which kicked up a huge cloud of dust you can see in this picture on the right. And indeed, when they got there, they realized, there was no actual attack. They were just being the butt of a joke. This did amuse Bao Si. She did smile. However, it angered and alienated the nobles. So later on, the Marquis of Shen made a pact with some nomads outside the border of China, the western border in what is Central Asia. These were called the Chuanrong nomads. And throughout Chinese history, there were often invasions from nomadic peoples who moved around and fought on horseback from the western border. So it was a constant threat they had to face and deal with. So the Marquis of Shen made an alliance with a group of these nomads to attack King Yo because they had them as a common enemy. During the invasion, King Yo lit the beacon fires, but of course this time nobody came. So King Yo was killed, Baozi was captured, and this did not end the Cho dynasty, but it did lead to the decline of the Cho kings. They never retained their previous level of power and prestige. Their capital moved eastward to Luoyang to help it be more protected, and this marked the beginning of the Eastern Cho dynasty. So here's a map of the first part of the Eastern Cho dynasty called the Spring and Autumn period. And basically, the kingdom was in name theoretically united under one king, but in fact divided into different competing states. You can see the capital marked by a star. Another name for it was Chengzhou. And this was the capital of the Cho state, which is really just the territory around the capital. That was the only area that was actually under the control of the Cho kings during the Eastern Cho dynasty. The rest was basically ruled by the dukes of the various provinces or other powers.